invite Shariki back up and Simone back up, please. We're going to have a panel discussion here, a rapid fire but deep panel discussion, and I think I will stay here as well. So thank you to the three speakers. That was a very rich tour. We do have until 2:30, and I think I will I'll kick it off with a question, but I won't ask you to answer the question yet. I'll ask you to think about it a bit so that we can go to Olivia and any others that want to come up to the mic. If we don't have time for my question, that's fine, because I want to encourage the audience participation. So let's start off with Olivia. And if anybody else has a question to ask, why don't you come right up, and if we have a few, then we'll take a few questions and then we'll speak. Yes, Olivia, please.
Thank you all for the great presentations. I would have 1,000 questions, but I'll limit myself to Shriki. All the different influences that you listed on obesity in the minority populations of color are serious problems themselves already. So I'm wondering, how can we make sure that obesity is a priority in a community that already has so much to deal with and has so many other problems that they're fighting on a daily basis, especially in the current political landscape?
Hold on there for a second? Yeah, if you don't mind. It's, sorry, different format. Okay. Just to keep us awake. Yes, would you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Nelly, roundtable member. Acculturation for most populations that are migrating is a survival strategy. Are there factors that we're aware of that are typically positive as they go through that process that may be helpful for solutions? Or, on the other hand, factors that are negative that may be harmful when we look at their health in regards to obesity?
Great, thank you. Maybe one more, Chris, do you want to ask? And then we'll go to the panel.
Thank you.
Well, since you're two, let's wait. Let's hear a couple answers, and then we'll come back to you. This is fast. So I think Shariki first, the question from Olivia.
Thanks for the two easy questions.
Really?
I think the first question is prompts an answer about co-creation of interventions, because there's a certain amount of insider knowledge and experience needed to come up with a sustainable solution. And even though some, we talk about being evidence-based, and we have interventions that we think work, and we're reluctant to kind of start from the beginning. But I think once inside of a community with people from that community, they're setting priorities, and they usually include health as they understand it. But I don't think that coming in as an outsider and trying to tweak an intervention to fit is deep enough. I think we're too superficial, and so the movement towards co-production of care and co-creation could probably open some new doors, which requires training of health professionals out of the expert model and into the partner model.
Great, thank you. The second question then about acculturation. You want to take that and maybe Harriet?
I remember. I think that the answer is yes. Hopefully there are positives and negatives related to acculturation. I didn't mention the term assimilation because that sometimes people cross that with acculturation. My general feeling about that is that the use of acculturation as an explanation is in itself problematic, because it puts the emphasis on how people are reacting without looking at what is their potential for acculturation, what is their potential for integrating into the society apart from the desire. And it implies, the acculturation implies that people, it might even be kind of a John Henryism thing, if you know that model of trying against all odds, because on the framework, which I didn't go into in detail, although I had laid the groundwork, there's one point about irreconcilable outsider status. And I think that when people try to acculturate, it'd be like that to try to integrate into the community by being like that and taking on the behaviors, but still being outsiders, it might be very counterproductive, and it may be more productive for people to remain within their cultural bubble and use the strengths that are there. So it's really complicated, and I think there's more thought that needs to be put into it. But in the literature, especially the migration literature, the acculturation is such a dominant frame that there's really no room for talking about, except for a few scholars who've done a good job at doing this, of talking about how much of this is this type of stress response, for example, and what coping strategies do people have. So I hope that gives you, I mean, that's what I think, but it's a whole, it's a whole workshop, and it's also several doctoral dissertations and research programs.
Harriet, did you want to comment on acculturation, or didn't?
I can make some comments that actually, it's the same theme with migrants and peoples of color and indigenous peoples. It's just perhaps to different degrees with many extra caveats. And in the work that I did early on in my career with the peoples in British Columbia, we paid attention to the foods, and we paid attention to how people use their foods. And there was obesity there already, but it was just obvious that they didn't want to get into talking about obesity. I mean, they just said, well, that's just the way we are. It's just the way we are. And, it kind of creeps up, and people don't really see it as a problem with their children. And so they were really dealing with, as you were saying, they were dealing with all these other things. How can they start thinking about obesity on top of all this other stuff? So in fact, they didn't, and they don't, until now they're starting to recognize that it's a big problem. And with respect to acculturation, they say, oh, you mean you want to deculturize us? So I think it's important to let people recognize their strengths and to find solutions from within those strengths.
Great, thank you. Okay, Chris, you're next.
Chris Economos, the Roundtable and Tufts. Thank you all very much. I wanted to pick up on one of your last bullets, Harriet, which was build an international knowledge platform. So I didn't know if, I think that's underway as people explore and learn and publish, but did you mean something bigger than that? Was it kind of a vision statement that you wanted to share with us? And if so, what would that look like, and how could people in the room play a role in that?
Well, the idea for this international knowledge platform has been talked about within our commission, on how when we met with some of the New Zealand people in the course of our deliberations in the commission, we learned a great deal about how people want to handle their problems, and they want to handle obesity in their own way. Don't tell me about food composition. Don't tell me about how many minutes I have to do this or that. Just let me organize something so that our people can get back to nature and enjoy the environment that they live in. That's one perspective. That's one perspective. But there are so many ideas, not only from within the food system and how to eat healthy food and to teach children how to eat healthy food, that it really is worth documenting. And the FAO and probably the WHO as well, but certainly the FAO, a couple of offices within FAO. One is dealing with nutrient composition, and they always welcome new food composition data from indigenous areas. And then there is the Office of Indigenous and Tribal Experiences. So they now have an initiative where they are looking closely at 6 different cultures, building on our earlier experience. And so they are building a platform for recording indigenous experiences And it will take a lot of, when you think about how many indigenous cultures and good things there are to learn, it just needs to start.
Yes, next.
David Fukuzawa, member of the Roundtable. Just a thought and then a question. The whole day has struck me not only about food and physical activity, but about the impacts of globalization, and that in many ways, food and physical activities has become simply another manifestation of that issue and what it does to cultures all over the world, much less here in the United States. So that was just what struck me. But I was also here what you were saying about decolonizing. It struck me that is perhaps a lesson not just for indigenous peoples, but and for our approach to them, but for everybody. I mean, how we think about communities in this country and elsewhere. And I'm just kind of wondering. I think the issue of culture is not one that we have talked about a lot here, because we're so concerned about the public health aspects of food. But we have to eat. I mean, health or not, we have to eat. And we want to eat, usually, and almost always, there is some kind of cultural background to how we eat, and we don't think about those things. So I'm just kind of wondering if how we might use that, and like you were talking about. Are there opportunities that indigenous peoples can teach us about how we can sort of decolonize ourselves from the globalized food economy?
Well, I certainly agree that the potential is there for them to offer quite a lot of wisdom on how to go about working with their own people and to how to make change within their own communities. I gave you that one example from the Maori, but all people, well, let me just say, in working with many different cultures as I have, when you work with families and you work with women who are gatekeepers of what kind of foods come into the household, there's a lot to learn there. And I think if public health practitioners do as what Gretel Pelto calls formative research to understand the culture and the food system, there is a lot of background information there that is essential for building a good public health promotion program. Did I answer your question?
I don't know if there's an answer, but
Comments are welcome, and that was comment. All right, I'm going to make a comment, short one, and then ask Simon if he wants to comment or elaborate on that, and then we'll probably be out of time. And that was that I picked up a term that Harriet, you used, global mega forces, and it feels to me as though all three of you have talked about something in communities that you've studied or in your own localities that are very, very affected, have been very affected by global mega forces. And it can be positive, it can be negative, obviously, as we've acknowledged. But Simone, I think one of the things is I've referred to as we've learned a lot from Mexico's experience, but I wonder if you want to comment a little bit further on sort of how you're struggling, if you'll permit me the word, or handling what you're trying to do locally in Mexico or nationally in Mexico with global mega forces, because you and I spoke about this a bit before.
Yes, well, just one thought is that since Mexico is a very big market, the investment in lobbying to avoid some of the policy attempts is very strong also, and it is higher, is bigger than the local action. So, for example, in this recent negotiation of NAFTA, which is now USMCA, is the new acronym. In this negotiation, there was an attempt to submit an appendix that will limit the ability of the countries to rule on labeling of foods and products. So this is one example, and this has happened before with tobacco also. this is one example of these attempts of this of globalization and trade to affect how countries are able to regulate health or to improve regulation or to prevent obesity. So this is something that I think is very important. And well, there are other effects that we are watching every day, and one is the food. How is food being transformed? So in Mexico, I will say the traditional Mexican food is very healthy, but the way it is prepared now has been transformed in the last 20 years maybe. So the portions are bigger. They use more fat, salt, sugar. So this transition has to do with bigger determinants as trade and globalization and subsidies in the U.S. to corn and all these factors. So it has a global angle that is very important to have results in the local level. And I think it's easier, that's my opinion, I think it will be easier for smaller countries because they don't represent a big market, so they don't get so much opposition from multinational companies. But in countries like Brazil, Mexico, and the US, it will be very difficult to achieve the necessary regulations.
Thanks. And in journalism, we would say you buried the lead, because if you'll allow me, I think the good news story is that effort to impose restrictions on labeling at the country level in the USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA, that was pushed back successfully, right? Defeated, if you will, successfully. So that was not allowed because civil society groups and public health and other experts spoke up, right?
Yes.
All right, we have to end on a positive note. All right, thank you very much to our panelists and everyone.